So let's have a look now. So now he's trying to walk in, but we can also kill the enemy just by tapping and holding. This tutorial will cover creating an enemy that targets and moves towards the player. The next tutorial will set up a wave system to spawn enemies after a certain amount of distance traveled in the game, so stay tuned if you're interested in that. The first thing we want to do is create an enemy controller script that will control targeting and following the player. So if we head over into our scripts folder, we can right click, create C# script. I'm going to call this one enemy controller. You can go ahead and open that one up. Now we will need these, so I'm just going to leave them in there to make it easier. But first I'm going to define a few variables. The first one is going to be our player, so I can type in private transform. This will be our player. Now we also want to serialize the field here, and next to it we can type in private float. We'll have our move speed, and I'm going to set that to 5F by default. I'm also going to serialize field, and we can have a private float for our range, and that one can be equal to 7.5F by default. Now I also want a public bool, and this is going to be targeting player. We'll set that equal to false. Now in our start method we want to get our player, so we can do player equals game object dot find game object with tag, and inside the brackets we can type in player dot transform semicolon. Now we need to edit the update void, so I'm going to do an if statement. I'm going to go to if, and we're going to get the vector3 dot distance from our transform dot position towards our player's position, because it's already a transform. We're going to say if that is less than or equal to our range, then we want to move towards the player. We're going to set our transform dot position equal to a vector3 dot move towards. We're going to move from our transform dot position towards our player dot position, and our speed is going to be our move speed multiplied by time dot delta time. We're also going to face towards the player, so we can just type in transform dot look at, and we just want to look at the player. I'm also going to set targeting player equal to true, and we can do an else statement, and I'm going to set targeting player equal to false. We're not targeting the player because we're out of the range. Now that's cool, except we need a health component now, so we can control the health of the enemy and we can damage the enemy as a player. So I'm going to minimize this, and back in the editor I'm going to create another C# script, and this is going to be the health component. So let's open that up. Now we're also going to make use of our start and update, so that's cool. And we want two variables. So we're going to have a public float. That's going to be our max health. And we'll also have a private float of our current health. Now in the start, we're going to make sure we set our current health equal to our max health. In our update, we want to check if our current health is less than or equal to 0, then we can remove whatever object this is attached to. So if current health is less than or equal to 0, then current health is going to equal to max health, so we're resetting our health. And we also want our game object dot set active to false. Now we need a couple of other voids as well. So I'm going to have a public void called update health. And we're going to take in a float of the amount. When we update the health, we want our current health to plus equal to amount. Now we also want a public void reset health, and that's also just going to set our current health equal to our max health. So back in our enemy controller, we need to add a reference to our health component that will be attached to our enemy object. So we can have a private health component, and I'll call this health. Now in the start method, we also want to set our health. So health is going to equal to get component health component. Now we also need a void on trigger stay, and we're going to grab our collider other. We're going to check if our other.tag is equal to weapon. So if it's the weapon that hits the enemy, then we want our health dot update health to -1f. So we're going to lose a health point every time we stay in the weapon. The next thing we need to do is edit the move component. So I'm just going to drag this out, and we can see we have the move component, and I'll just close that again. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get references to our health component. So private health component health, our player, so private game object player, and also our enemy controller, so private enemy controller enemy. Now we also need to get references to these in the start void. So I'm going to say health is going to equal to get component health component, player is equal to game object dot find game object with tag player, and enemy is going to be equal to get component enemy controller. Now we have an issue here because we're using our move component for our ground as well, so our ground isn't going to have a health component or an enemy controller. So we need to do an if statement just before we have these. So I can do if get component health component does not equal null, then we're going to set our health component, and I can just copy this, and we'll do the same for the enemy. So all we have to do is change that to enemy controller. So enemy controller. So we don't always just want to move at the same speed. Some enemies might move faster, some enemies might move slower. So we need to check firstly whether our enemy is an enemy or if it's a ground. So we can say if our enemy does not equal to null and not enemy dot targeting player. So if we're not targeting the player and we're an enemy, we're going to set our transform dot position to plus equal to our negative transform dot forward times by speed times by time dot delta time. Now we can say else if our enemy does not equal null and our enemy is targeting the player, then we can set our transform dot position to plus equal to vector3 dot 0. Now we're setting it to nothing, so we're not adding anything from here, which is fine. But we also want an else And we can just tab this out here. So else if we are the ground, then our transform.position is going to plus equal to negative transform.forward times by speed times by time.delta time. Now once we've done that, I'm going to space out a bit. I want to do a simple check to make sure that the enemy is set active if for some reason it goes outside of the screen. So if our transform.position.z is less than our player's transform.position.z minus 10f, so that's just a value, we might have to edit it, but it's fine for now, and enemy does not equal null. So we're also making sure that we only run this check if we have an enemy controller attached to the object that this component is attached to. So then we can do health.reset health. So making sure that our health goes back to the default value. So that could be 5 or 10, it's up to you. And then we'll also have GameObject.setActive to false. So we're gonna technically remove the enemy. Okay, so let's go ahead and set up our enemy. So I'm gonna create a cube and I'm gonna reset its transform. And we might just move it back a bit. Also might change its position up a little bit so it's out of the ground. This is fine. Our box collider is fine, but we also want our enemy controller. We want our health component. So I might set max health to 10. And we also want our move component. So we can just ignore these values. Awesome. So I'm gonna make sure I name it enemy. So let's head to the player and check that we have a weapon tag. We don't actually have a weapon tag, so that's fine. What we can do on the parent is we can add a box collider. We can add an is trigger. And let's just have a look. Where is our box collider? Okay, it looks like a cube. So we're gonna have to edit that a little bit. We're not actually going to be worrying about the height of this collider, which is fine. But now we also need a tag. So I'm gonna add a tag, click on the plus, and we can type in weapon. So if we click back on our flashlight parent, we can add our weapon and make sure we save that. Now we also want to create a prefab. So if we go to assets, prefabs, we grab our enemy, drag that one in. Now we've got an enemy prefab, which means in our object pooler, we can change the size to 2, and we can have our enemy. And maybe we can say we want to have a total possibility of 50 enemies on the screen, or of this type of enemy anyways, because we don't have a lot of screen, so that should be fine. So one other thing I forgot to do, so we need to tag our player as player so we can find it. So I need to add a rigid body to the enemy, just because if we don't add this rigid body, our triggers are not going to work and we won't be able to damage the enemy. So I'm going to make sure I click on remove use gravity. I'm going to freeze the Y position and we're going to freeze the X and Z rotation. Now let's test that out. I'm going to plug my phone in and open up Unity Remote 5. If we go edit, project settings, and then editor, I'm using an iOS device, so I'm making sure I've got any iOS device checked. Now there's one more issue. If we have a look and run play, if I'm not attacking, the enemy will eventually die because our flashlight parent is still set to true. So that means we need to change our light object to flashlight parent. So let's have a look now. So now he's trying to walk in, but we can also kill the enemy just by tapping and holding. Okay, so let's try that again. Awesome. We also need to make sure we override our prefab. So make sure you click overrides and apply all. So this will add our rigid body to our prefab. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments section what you'd like to add to this game maybe, and we'll see what we can do from there. Be sure to support me on Patreon because I really appreciate it and it means a lot. You also get cool rewards, so thank you to Benonies and Joshua for their pledges this month. Also join the Discord server for any help and just to hang out and say hi, you know, maybe show off your games, have a look at some memes, you know, pretty cool. Be sure to subscribe and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks.